Професор історії Лубомyr Luciuk більшість свого життя присвятив науковому дослідженню інтернування українців в Канаді під час Першої світової війни і сьогодні пояснює важливість правильного вивчення цих часів канадської історії.
Конгрес українців Канади 20 червня відзначує століття закінчення програми насильного інтернування українців в Канаді під час Першої світової війни.
I'm going to talk today about how I first came to know about Canada's first national internment operations. I think that's a story that many of your viewers have no idea about. It all began around 1978 here in Kingston, Ontario. I was a young graduate student then, just beginning my MA in historical geography under the direction of Professor Peter Goheen at Queen's University. And Peter told me that I should study the history of Kingston's very small Ukrainian community. And quite frankly, I was not keen on that. It seemed to me, as the son of post-Second World War Ukrainian political refugees, so-called DPs, that I already knew that community. I'd grown up in it. There were some interwar immigrants that I also knew from our parish hall and from church. And I didn't think that there was much of a story there. Nothing really I could say that would be useful or interesting. Survivors. Now, there were very, very few survivors, as you can imagine, by the time we got around to doing this work. Yuri Louvet, in his very good film, Freedom Had a Price, interviews one of them. And at the very end of that film, and you hear this gentleman saying, I don't want to talk about this very much because they could come after me again. They could imprison me again. So there was fear. There was a desire to get on with their lives. There was fear. Then comes, of course, the Great Depression, the Second World War. People sort of buried this story. And so we had that reluctance and that pushback at the very beginning. When we were articulating, well, what is it, what do you want? Obviously, the media asks you this, government asks you, what do you want from all of this? And I wasn't quite sure at first how to answer it. And I found the answer by speaking to Mary Manco-Haskett. Mary Manco-Haskett was born in Montreal. She was just over 6 years old when her entire family was rounded up and transported by rail to the remote community of it becomes known as Spirit Lake. It's in the Abitibi in northwest central Quebec. It was essentially in the middle of the boreal forest of the Abitibi. And it became one of the largest internment camps, mainly populated by Ukrainians. There were a few others there, but mainly Ukrainians, including families, including men, women, and children. When Mary was there, her sister, Nellie, died there. We still don't actually know where Nellie is buried, for sure. There's a small cemetery that unfortunately has fallen into disrepair. It's one of the things we're trying to still restore. But at Spirit Lake, Mary was there for 2 or 3 years. And when they finally were released, paroled back to Montreal, their little green grocery shops, kind of a corner store, had been confiscated. They'd lost that. So as soon as the war ended, they actually returned to Europe, went back to what becomes interwar Poland, Western Ukraine, Halychina. They come back again to Canada just before the Second World War because they could see the writing on the wall. So Mary one day gets in touch with me and she tells me this fascinating story. She says, I saw an article that you and Bogdan Kordan co-authored in the Globe and Mail. And I want to talk to you about that because I was in one of those camps. So I looked up Mary. She was living in Hamilton then. She's long since passed, God rest her soul. And I went to interview her. And by then, of course, I knew much more about the internment operation. So the interview went better. I could ask her questions. She'd only been 6.5, 7 years old when she was there, so she couldn't tell us very much. But she did what she could. And I sort of asked her, I said, Mary, you're aware of the fact that the National Association of Japanese Canadians is getting compensation. Individual survivors are getting money, $22,000 or $23,000 each or whatever it was. And I said, do you want money? Do you want an apology? And Mary looked at me and she said, Lubomyr, if you and your friends are going to organize a campaign around this, your campaign should be about memory, not money. Wow. Here was a person who had experienced the indignity of being rounded up. She was a Canadian-born Montrealer with the rest of her family, sent to an internment camp where her father was forced to do heavy labor for the profit of his jailers. She watches as her sister die there. And she's not bitter. And she's not saying, pay me. She's not talking about intergenerational trauma or anything like that. She's not talking about, the descendants have to be paid off. She said, no, there should be no payments. Why should a Canadian today, and I will repeat this, why would a Canadian today have to apologize to me for something that, maybe his great-grandfather or grandfather did to my parents? Today's Canadians don't owe me an apology for what someone did almost 100 years ago. And she said, compensation for what? To who? And certainly not, and she said certainly not to descendants, because they didn't suffer it. I did, and I don't want anything. What I want your campaign to be about is memory. And why did she emphasize that? Well, here's the story. Here's that part of the story. One day, Mary Munko is reading the Globe and Mail. She sees this article, and she calls me up to get to talk to me about what she'd experienced. And when I go to see her, she tells me that she, as a mother, had tried to tell her own children about her experiences in the First World War. And they didn't believe her, her own children. They said, Mom, how could you have been interned in Canada? We've never heard about that in school. We haven't seen any movies, there's no books. You must be thinking about something that happened in the old country, in Ukraine, and Alachina. Maybe, when you went back there in the interwar period, maybe it was something happened that you're a repressed memory or something like that. So Mary's own children, Fran Haskett and so on, and they ended up being very good friends and supporters of the UKLA and so on. But at the time, originally, they didn't believe their own mother. And so they did a reasonable thing, though. If I said to you, I was held in this camp called Spirit Lake. Okay, it's in Quebec. Okay, Mom, here's an atlas of Canada. They opened it up. Here's the province of Quebec. All the places are shown there. Show us where Spirit Lake is. She couldn't. She couldn't, not because she didn't know the name or didn't know roughly the place it was on the map, but the name had been changed. The name was changed from Spirit Lake to Lake Beauchamp. And so she couldn't find Spirit Lake. And so her own children, until Bodan and I wrote that piece in the Globe and Mail, didn't believe their own mother. So this is why it was so important for us to recover this memory, to put up plaques across Canada, to put up statues done by our good friend John Boxtel at Castle Mountain, at Spirit Lake, the interned Madonna holding a child, walking with another child, recalling this episode in Canadian history. Some people say, well, if you don't learn your history, you're forced to repeat it. And the flip side of that is what we learn from history is that we don't learn anything from history. Somewhere in the middle, I think, is the truth. I think we can learn from history. This was an important episode in Ukrainian Canadian history. I think it crippled our settler pioneer community. People who had been lured to Canada with promises of freedom and free land overnight found themselves classified as enemy aliens because they were carrying Austro-Hungarian passports. Some of them, over 8,000, were herded into internment camps across the country. What little wealth they had was taken away from them. Not all of it was returned. They were forced to do heavy labor for the profit of their jailers in remote frontier hinterlands. Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans were categorized as second-class prisoners of war, even though they were civilians, and put in these hard labor camps, whereas first-class German prisoners were held in places like Fort Henry. They lost the right to vote. The newspapers were censored. There were selective deportations. And the internment operations continued until June 20th, 1920. Now, again, your listeners will know, your viewers will know, that the war, the First World War, the Great War, ends with the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. But the internment operations continue under the direction of General Sir William Dillon Otter until June 20th, 1920. So what we're recalling this year on June 20th is in fact just that, the end of the internment operations, the 100th anniversary, the centennial. And with the statues, with the plaques, with the various commemorative and educational projects funded by the Endowment Council of the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund, we have in fact created a corpus, a body of art and literature and plaques and statues and information online and in books and so on that is available to everyone from grade schoolers to teachers to scholars to visitors to Canada who are traveling and see these statues or see these plaques. Again, one of the very early statues that we unveiled was at Castle Mountain in Banff National Park. And I mean, we all know it's just reopened. Banff is the jewel in the crown of the national park system. Many visitors don't know that that park, many of the roads and bridges and so on, were built by enemy alien labor, forced labor, under guard. When we were unveiling the first statue at Castle Mountain, I will always remember the ceremony had ended. We were just starting to break apart, and a car came down the highway, and two young men, very well dressed, nice car, got out and said, what's the crowd about? And they came up to me and asked me, and I said, well, we're commemorating the internment of Ukrainians in this place during the First World War. And these turned out to be two nice American Jewish boys from New York City. Where else? Visiting Banff. One, no surprise, doctor, the other one, lawyer, right? Two buddies. And they come and they go, we never heard about this. So I took those two young men and I walked them across the street and down the way a bit and actually walked them onto the physical site of the internment camp. And we could still pull barbed wire out of the ground. Now, those two guys will never forget that in Canada in the First World War, Ukrainians and other Europeans were interned as enemy aliens. That's a powerful message to send. So all sorts of positive things have been done. And let me just share a few of them. If viewers go to the National Museum of History, the Canadian National Museum of History in Gatineau, Ottawa-Gatineau, there is a permanent exhibit about Canada's first national internment operations now, thanks to the work of the Endowment Council. People may read Bourdain's scholarly book, No Free Men, about the internment episode. I mean, this has been published by McGill Queen's University Press. It's available in serious libraries everywhere. There are the films by Ryan Boyko now, which complement what Yuri Luhovey did in the beginning. There are teacher's guides so that any teacher anywhere in Canada can work with his or her Ministry of Education because it's part of the curriculum of every province. And they can use those teachers' guides that we've prepared, teaching aids, to tell the story. They're allowed to do it, but many teachers say, well, I don't have material about that. Yes, you do now. If you're traveling across the country, you can stop at various places where there will be permanent exhibits, not just the Canadian Museum of History, but think, for example, too, at Banff. Thanks to the work of the Endowment Council and UCLA in particular, we now have a permanent exhibit at Cave and Basin, which was one of the sites of the internment camps, about Canada's first national internment operations. Now, I'm going to admit, because I think it's important that we recognize it, that when we're working with all levels of government and municipalities and federal, provincial, we always have to negotiate the story. And sometimes we're not always happy with the story as it's presented in some of these facilities. So at Cave and Basin, I think the story of the internment operations was somewhat deliberately watered down by Parks Canada because they don't want to tell the whole story in all its unpleasantness. There will be a Heritage Minute. I think many of your viewers will know what a Heritage Minute is. They see them in the movie theaters and on CBC and so on. A Heritage Minute is being done about the internment operations. That will be seen by millions of people. So there are a whole range of projects, everything from a plaque on a wall somewhere to a statue to a physical building in Banff. Several million people go to Banff every year in a normal year. And, some of them are going to go to that free exhibit and see it and learn. People are going to see the Heritage Minute. People are going to pick up the books. Teachers are going to use the materials. We're still teaching the teachers. We're still talking, as I am today, about the internment operations to get the story out. Because it's a profoundly Canadian story, but it's also a story that affected our community and others between 1914 and 1920 and had a lasting, I think, crippling impact. The fragmentation of our community politically, socially, religiously dates back to these same years. the tension between right and left, the tension between Pravoslavny and Catholic. All of this starts then. And it's only now being healed. It's only now being healed. And I frankly think that, if I can just add this on, you will remember, I'm sure, that on VE Day, the 8th of May this year, that was the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, our plan was to unveil and bless a commemorative stained glass window in London, England, honoring the Ukrainian Canadians who volunteered for service overseas during the Second World War, and who, after the war, some of them remained in Europe and helped save the DPs. So I wouldn't be sitting here in Kingston talking to you if it hadn't been for the Ukrainian Canadians who helped save the DPs, people like Bogdan Panchuk, Stanley Frolik, Tony Yaramovich, and Kharpliva, and Chernyavsky, and many, many more, Bill Kirilluk, many, many more. Okay, those men and women went overseas, saved the DPs. My parents came here. I was born here. And when I think about it now, what do I think about? I think those men and women in uniform were the sons and daughters of the internees, of the enemy aliens. And Panchuk used to tell me, we volunteered, for patriotic reasons, for adventure, all the normal things that people volunteer to go fight in a war for. But we also wanted to demonstrate our loyalty. We wanted to prove that we were loyal. And so Ukrainians were overrepresented in the Canadian military and merchant marine during the Second World War, in part because they were still feeling the consequences of the internment operations. They knew what had happened to Ukrainians in World War I when we were the enemy alien. They wanted to prove by putting on the uniform that they were not disloyal, that they were in fact loyal, patriotic Canadians. And they earned the right then to speak to government and to help save the DPs. And so now I'm the son of DPs. I'm an old man now, but we covered the story of the internment operations. We told that story, and now we're honoring the veterans of World War II who saved my parents. So there's a circle here. And I think that, the more I think about it, the more excited I get, because finally, I think in the 21st century, we as a community can move forward on a different plane. It's no longer going to be, no, to Staro Prabuli, Novi Prabuli, and those are the pioneer settler stock, and those are the assimilated fifth generation or the fourth wave and all this kind of stuff. There will always be immigrants coming. There will always be different perspectives. But in terms of the major story between 1891, the beginning of settlement in Canada, and the present day, we have the sons and daughters of the DPs have thanked the veterans who saved our parents by remembering what happened to the veterans' parents and grandparents. So it's a nice completion. I feel very satisfied that in my career as an academic, going all the way back as we started with Mrs. Kharitenyuk on Colburn Street, she not only told me about Nick Sakalyuk, but she gave me one other tip, and that was, you should talk to a man called Bogdan Panchuk. He lives in Montreal. I think he's a teacher. He would know a lot about things, about Ukrainian things in Canada. And again, I had no clue who he was. But I went and saw him, and he and Nick Sakalyuk, between the two of them, Bogdan Panchuk, Nick Sakalyuk, changed my whole life. There you go.
Проєкт відзначення 20 червня спонсорований Канадським фондом визнання інтернування під час Першої світової війни.